Good evening. My name is Bao Tran, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous peoples that live with these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum, the Center for Sustainability Education, the Department of Environmental Studies and Environmental Science, and the Department of Earth Science, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Getting to Net Zero, Climate Challenges and Solutions. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported that rising temperatures over the last century have resulted in major disruptions to humans and natural systems. These disruptions have heavily affected people living in low and middle income countries. Scientists attribute global warming to the rise in emissions of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and water vapor. This finding gave rise to net zero, a solution which seeks to balance the amount of greenhouse gases released with the amount of greenhouse gases removed from the atmosphere. As of 2021, countries representing 68% of the global economy have committed to the net zero goal. However, as Dr. Hausker will discuss, meeting this goal is challenging. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Karl Hausker, is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute Climate Program. At this institute, he oversees projects that analyze various climate mitigation strategies, net zero pathways, electricity pathways, and the social cost of carbon. Working for more than 3 decades in the fields of climate change, energy, and the environment, he has led projects for the U.S. Agency for International Development, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the Western Climate Initiative, and the California Air Resources Board. From 2007 to 2013, he was a vice president at ICF International. Previously, he served as a deputy director at the Center for Climate Strategies and as a principal at Hagler Bailey, an industry-leading energy consulting firm. Dr. Hausker is also the parent of senior economic major Tara Hausker. As a student at Dickinson College, which prides itself on its commitment to sustainability, it is one of my priorities to facilitate discussions about global warming and what we can do to help alleviate it. As someone who does not major in environmental studies or environmental science, I do not know extensively about climate issues and how to solve them. Nevertheless, after coming to Dickinson College, I was taught to contribute to the college's carbon neutral effort by using a desk lamp instead of ceiling light, recycling my boxes, and minimizing my food waste. I eventually learned that every effort matters, no matter how small it may be. Having a healthy environment is essential not only to our physical well-being, but also to our economic prosperity. I hope that tonight's event will inform us more about different challenges to mitigating the impacts of climate change, a variety of solutions to these challenges, and how solving them can contribute to alleviating other economic and security consequences. Following the program, there will be a question and answer session, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinions expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speakers, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speakers and everyone is in attendance, Please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of emergency, please know that handicap accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now, please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. Karl Hausker.
Thank you very much, Bao. My microphone sounds like it's on? Great. And Bao made a good introduction to the title of my talk tonight, Getting to Net Zero. We were talking at dinner earlier that, 20, 30 years ago when I first started working on this issue with Neil Leary when we were both at EPA, the discussion was, well, how much should we cut emissions? How fast? What is it going to cost? And we're now, in 2021, anyone serious about this issue knows that we have to cut emissions all the way to zero, probably about mid-century, or to get to net zero. But before I jump into that, let's take a tour of the Clark Forum 60 million years ago. A lot of you don't know what a storied history the Clark Forum has. But 60 million years ago, the speaker was a stegosaurus who said, "The picture's pretty bleak, gentlemen. The world's climates are changing, the mammals are taking over, and we all have the brain the size of a walnut." So update 2021, the climate is changing, and yes, mammals caused it. We are now the mammals dominant on this earth, but fortunately, we have a brain larger than a walnut. Most of us have a brain larger than a walnut, and we can solve this with the technologies we already have and with technologies that are near commercial, and with certain other changes, we can get to net zero and we can preserve a safe climate. So I'm here to talk about those pathways to get to net zero over the next 30 years. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is to give the IPCC perspective on what it takes. As Bao said, this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that issues reports that synthesize the best science and analysis. I'm going to talk about the 4 key strategies to get to net zero: efficiency, electrification, zero carbon generation of electricity, and carbon capture. And then I'm going to do sort of a deep dive on 2 of those strategies, one on electricity, and explore the role of renewables in getting to zero carbon generation of electricity. And I'm going to offer a dissenting view to what I'm going to say. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon capture, the 4th strategy, and what I view as the imperative for us to commercialize the ability to capture carbon before it leaves an emission source, as well as to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, capture it, and store it safely underground. There's a dissenting view on this too. So I'm already kind of trying to preempt some of the questions you may have by offering some dissenting views. Throughout this talk, you're going to hear me talk about spreading our chips like we're at Las Vegas. Do you put all your chips on just a couple of numbers? No, it's a better strategy to spread your chips. And I'm going to make the case to you that when we talk about the technologies needed to solve this problem, to preserve a safe climate for you and your children, we need to spread our chips. I'm going to go pretty fast through some material. I'm going to make the PowerPoint available with lots of web links for you to dive into some of the studies I'm going to cite, and I invite you to do that. So first, let's go to the IPCC, a forum for the world's top scientists and analysts that every roughly 7 or 8 years issue a report on the science, the impacts, and mitigation strategies. New science report came out just this fall. We'll have to wait till 2022 to get the updated impacts and mitigation report. In the meantime, the most recent IPCC research on pathways was published in 2018. It was called Global Warming of 1.5 degrees. How can we achieve that? And I'm going to talk about what some of their conclusions were. The IPCC looked at hundreds of modeling studies of what it would take to get to net zero and preserve warming at no more than 1.5 degrees. And it is a daunting task. We are at about 40 billion tons of CO2 a year as a globe. And to try to keep warming at around 1.5 degrees, we're going to have to take that 40 billion tons down to zero over about the next 30 years. So we need a very steep decline in these next 30 years. And there's also a pretty good likelihood of actually overshooting safe concentration levels for 1.5 degrees at that time. And so by 2040, 2050, we actually are likely to need to begin to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, either through technological means or through what's called natural solutions, enhancing tree planting, other vegetation, and enhancing the storage of CO2 in soils. So one of the key messages here is we're going to have to very likely get to negative emissions later in this century. The IPCC looked at a lot of models, as I said, but highlighted 4 illustrative pathways. They labeled P1, P2, P3, P4. P1 had the very steep near-term declines in emissions, and as you can see, requires the least negative emissions as we go out to the second half of the century. P2, P3, P4 all had more gradual declines in the CO2 emissions, and to keep warming at 1.5 had much larger negative emissions in the out years. So I just want you to, we're going to come back to this a minute when we talk about carbon capture, but it's important to know what the IPCC said and the different needs for negative emissions. So how can we get on this very steep decline in our CO2 emissions? And I should just say as a footnote, I'm going to talk about CO2 today. Many of you know that there are 5 other greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, I think Bao noted them: methane, nitrous oxide, and some trace industrial gases. Those are important too, less of a contributor than CO2. We need to work on all those gases. What will it take? When we look at modeling studies by the IPCC, by the International Energy Agency, IEA, by IRENA, the International Renewables Agency, as well as US modelers such as the E3 Consulting Group, the Princeton Net America study, and an example I'm going to describe here, Jim Williams out at USF. The 4 key strategies that are very common across all of these modeling studies. So I'll show an example from Jim Williams. 4 strategies. I'm going to start with energy efficiency. We need to deploy all sorts of technologies and measures that can reduce our energy use by being more efficient. And this study and many others said we can reduce our energy use per person by probably a third by 2050 and still maintain our quality of life. And we're doing this already by things like LED light bulbs, more efficient buildings with insulation, things like that, and our vehicles and our industrial facilities. So that's step 1, be as efficient as possible. Strategy 2 is electrification. We need to electrify every end use we can possibly think of, substituting the direct use of electricity for the combustion of fossil fuels. Examples, our cars. We're starting to drive more electric cars, burn less gasoline. In our buildings, we can heat our homes with electricity rather than natural gas. We can cook with electricity instead of gas, et cetera, across industrial uses too. We can take, over the next 30 years, electricity from supplying about 20% of our direct end use up to 60%. Some of that is the direct use of electricity, and this little light blue bar there is taking electricity and producing things like hydrogen or ammonia, which when then combusted does not emit CO2. So that's part of the electrification strategy. The third strategy, if we're going to electrify everything, we're going to produce a lot more electricity. And we need to produce that without CO2 emissions. And the good news here is that we have lots of ways to produce electricity with no CO2. We have solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, nuclear, and carbon capture technologies that can capture the CO2 after we burn a fossil fuel or burn biomass and then concentrate it and inject it safely into geologic formations. So we can take our current emissions of about 500 grams per kilowatt hour and reduce it almost to zero. And we have the technologies to do that, and some are near commercialization, some are fully commercialized. The fourth major strategy is capturing carbon. Capturing it from power plants, capturing it from industrial sources, or literally capturing it out of the air and storing it safely, whether it's in vegetation or soils or injected into geologic formations. This element is just at the pilot stage basically now, but we have plenty of room to increase that. So what would this look like? I'll just very quickly run through some illustrations here I've touched on. Vehicles, light-duty vehicles. We have almost just a few battery electric cars right now. We could displace light-duty vehicles, your typical cars and SUVs, by 100% by 2050. No more emissions from light-duty vehicles. When we move to medium or heavy-duty trucks, it's a little more complicated. It's a little tougher to use batteries. We probably want to use some hydrogen fuel cells over the next 30 years, as well as some batteries for the medium-duty trucks. And we still have problems to solve with aviation and shipping in the transport sector, but we have solutions on the horizon there too. What do we do with our buildings? I talked about space heating. We already use electricity for resistance heating and for heat pumps. We could move that to 100% over the next 30 years. Similarly with water heating, we could eliminate natural gas water heaters over the next 30 years and use electricity. Some of this is not rocket science at all. Some of this we know how to do right now. What happens when we electrify all those end uses we can imagine over the economy? Let's look at the right-hand side of this graph. This is again the Jim Williams study for the US. It's one study, but it is similar to what I call mainstream modeling of this. Right now, we use about 4,000 terawatt hours of electricity each year. If we electrify everything, that could triple by 2050. A lot of it would be the direct use of electricity in this gray area. Some of it would be industrial boilers converting to electricity. And here's electrolysis, using electricity to split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. So that is a tripling of our electricity production. How could we do it? Right now in 2020, we have nuclear, we have coal, we have a lot of gas, we have solar and wind beginning to grow. In this study, there's tremendous growth in wind in the light blue and solar in yellow. We maintain our nuclear power, we decrease our gas, we keep our blue hydro. In this scenario, wind and solar produce over 90% of the total electricity. That's relatively high for these studies, but it's plausible. But it's very important to note that this is complemented by what we call clean, firm sources. Wind and solar have variability or intermittency when there's no wind, when there's no sun. Clean, firm means there's a fuel source or a dependable operation of that power plant, and also ideally some ability to follow load and increase up and down. So there's the complementarity of the clean, firm with the renewable wind and solar. I'm just going to blow through a couple other studies so you'll believe me when I say mainstream modeling shows high levels of solar and wind, but not 100%. Here's a very recent study, 2021, by the International Energy Agency, modeling pathways for the entire globe to get to net zero by 2050. They have about 68% wind and solar by 2050. Total generation triples, just like in the US modeling. But the wind and solar is complemented by nuclear, the burning of hydrogen in turbines, and carbon capture and storage. Another example, by the world's greatest advocate of renewable energy, the International Renewable Energy Agency. They did a study in 2019, how to get to net zero. Their scenario had roughly 60% wind and solar in the blue and the yellow. They had some hydro, they had some bioenergy, but again, your wind and solar were complemented by clean, firm sources. So, and even if we turn back to the 2018 IPCC report and we look at the P1, P2, P3 illustrative scenarios of how the globe could get here, they came up with similar answer. Wind and solar provided about 63 to 81% of total electricity generation as that generation grows dramatically to electrify the economy. But wait a minute. We can't go to 100%. We're going to go to 60. We're going to go to 80. We're going to go to 90. Many of you have probably heard that renewables are now the cheapest source of electricity. They're winning the battle against coal and gas. They're now so cheap, they're going to be below the cost of existing coal and nuclear plants. Solar plants are cheaper than natural gas just about everywhere, 2023. So why not build an entire system just with wind and solar, maybe throw some batteries in? This is a puzzle, and this is a very important issue that anybody who cares about climate needs to think about. Over the last 10 years, there has been a revolution in renewables. The cost of wind and solar have dropped dramatically as we have scaled up production generation both in the US and around the world. The cost of a wind plant, if you just look at a wind plant standalone, has dropped by about 70% in terms of the dollars per megawatt hour average cost. Solar has dropped even more, solar photovoltaics. Cost of a standalone solar plant and the electricity that comes out has dropped by about 90%. The metric used here that's so widely quoted is called the levelized cost of energy from that plant just standing by itself, just putting out whatever power it does with other pattern of production. But as you all know, we don't get power from standalone plants. We integrate many plants into a grid, into a power system, and that's part of the key to understanding what's going on here. There's lots of advocates for 100% renewables among NGOs. Corporations are buying 100% renewable. Campuses are buying 100% renewable. Budweiser is advertising beer that's made with 100% renewable electricity. Not sure if that marketing campaign succeeded or failed, but I like to talk about this as a riddle. We have very cheap renewable power, but if we try to go to 100% renewable, your total system costs can increase dramatically. And this is borne out by many models that try to explore what would a 100% renewable system look like. So let's do a deep dive here. Why does that happen? As I said earlier, and as you all know, solar and wind are variable in their output. We can't control them. Some people say they're intermittent equivalently. Traditional generation is not like this. Traditional generation of a gas plant, a coal plant, nuclear plant, hydro plant, you can control, and sometimes you can dispatch it up and down to control, to meet load. So this graphic is from a study by Mark Jacobson, who, in this case, modeling just 2 days across the whole US if we had a big intertide system. Here's the green solar output, no surprise. It peaks during the middle of the day, and at night, nothing. No big surprise, right? But on a very cloudy day, these green humps would be even lower, and that happens sometimes. The blue line is a simulation of wind power. It has sort of a stochastic random element to it. We can have it in the day sometimes, we can have it at night. It's going to go up and down depending on weather patterns. So, and even if you aggregate them together in terms of the red line, you still have a quite variable power source, and you have to then ask, what do we do at night? What do we do when the wind doesn't blow, when this output goes up and down so significantly? There's also a seasonal variation to wind and solar power. Not surprisingly, solar power peaks in the summer when the angle of sun is most favorable, and when the region you live in tilts toward the sun. And so this is 72 months of simulation from Jacobson, where each green solar peak comes in the summer, and then solar output dips by a factor of, drops by a factor of 2 in the middle of winter, and then comes back up each summer, goes down in the winter. Wind in the US, averaging over the entire country, has an interesting pattern where it's highest in the spring and lowest in the fall, also varying by a very large factor. And if you combine these together into your total renewable output, again, you have total solar and wind varying by over 50% by season. So again, if you're going to run a power system on this, you have to ask, what do I do in the off-season, lowest in fall and winter? Daily fluctuation, seasonal fluctuation, and then the dreaded Dunkelflaute. Do we have any German majors here? German majors? Not too many. 0, it looks like. I love the way Germans make up big, long words. Dunkelflaute means dark doldrums, and it's real on the German power system. This is January 2017, where random weather fluctuation dramatically reduced solar and wind production for about 10 days. Something like this happens almost every winter. You can't predict exactly when it's going to happen, but you better be prepared for it if you're going to keep the lights on. The Germans, right now, have to turn on their coal plants and their gas plants up really high when they hit their Dunkelflaute. So a power system has to be able to cope with this too. So what happens to system costs? How do we solve this riddle of cheap solar and wind, but high system costs? This is from a Google white paper a couple years back that modeled an illustrative system with wind, solar, and storage batteries. And what they showed was, as you move from 0 renewables up toward 100%, as you move to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%, it's not too bad. You can complement it with some gas and some nuclear, some coal, or use your batteries. But at some point, you get a non-linear effect in the total system costs, even though each individual solar and wind plant is cheap. Why is that? Something called integration costs. It's keeping the lights on even with the variability of your solar and wind. What are integration costs? Transmission costs. You can keep the lights on by aggregating your solar and wind over bigger and bigger geographic territories, so if the wind dies in one part, it may still be blowing in another part. If it's cloudy somewhere here, maybe it's not cloudy someplace else. Load shifting. If you're getting a lot of power output from your solar in the middle of the day, maybe you can move loads from night or early morning or evening to the middle of the day. But shifting that load is not costless. It takes technology and it takes behavioral change on the part of your customers. Storage. Right now, you've probably heard, we have some great breakthroughs in battery costs. Lithium batteries, originally developed for phones and for cars, are now being used at utility scale to store 4 or 6 hours of power. But that's not a lot. That's not even one night full of storage, much less accounting for seasonal fluctuations or the dreaded Dunkelflaute. So you're going to have to incur storage costs for all three types of variability. The other thing you might do that drives up costs is overgeneration. If you are worried about your power output in the winter, you better size your power system to meet all that demand in winter. But maybe that's going to create a lot of excess capacity in the summer. That's an overgeneration cost. So in general, the solution to the riddle is that the integration costs get higher and higher as you approach 100%, as you cover these less frequent but intense changes in solar and wind output. Now, I'm going to say there is a dissenting view to what I just said. What I just described is accurately summarizing what mainstream modeling says about trying to get to 100% renewables. It may be technically feasible, but you have a huge cost you're going to undertake, which could undercut the political will to battle climate change, could undercut your desires to electrify end uses if people have to pay too much for their electricity. But there are modelers like Mark Jacobson out of Stanford, the Louther group in Finland, Teskey in Australia, who will put out pathways that say we can do this with 100% renewables. If you look deeply into those studies, there is massive expansion of transmission, massive amounts of battery storage, and even thermal storage in rocks, water, molten salt underneath buildings. Massive load shifting, some use of hydrogen and geothermal, some hydrogen turbines, but this tends to be a much smaller group of academic modelers, and you don't see this stuff coming out of governments or international agencies. I'm going to give 16 authors from NREL the last word on this issue if you don't believe me yet. NREL is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory out in Golden, Colorado. These are the people who have devoted their lives to developing and promoting wind and solar and other renewables. They put out what I view as a very significant paper earlier this year in which they said reducing our overall emissions will likely involve achieving very high levels of renewable generation, 80% or more, but potentially below 100%, but also applying non-renewable low-carbon resources, such as carbon capture and storage, to the electric sector. Reducing the cost of low-carbon generation in the electric sector, potentially by keeping non-renewable options, including CCS and nuclear, available, enables electrifying and thus decarbonizing other sectors, reducing the economy-wide carbon emissions. In other words, our authors at NREL are saying, don't put all of your chips on renewables. Complement them with clean firm. Let's turn to the role of carbon capture in net zero scenarios. Again, when you look at mainstream modeling across the IPCC, the IEA, IRENA, US studies by credible sources, there is a role for capturing CO2 before it is emitted at the end of a smokestack or from another industrial source. We can apply this technology to power plants, to various industrial sources, sometimes to industrial sources that aren't actually burning fossil fuel. The cement industry is a classic example. The production of cement causes CO2 emissions, aside from the combustion of fossil fuel. You need something to reduce those emissions and prevent them from going into the atmosphere. The other application, as I said before, is carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. We touched on that earlier. There are nature-based solutions, forests, enhancing forests, planting trees, changing farming techniques that allow more CO2 to remain stored in the soil. This is all good, and this is all relatively low cost, and it often has environmental co-benefits of preserving or enhancing natural lands. But there are limits to how much you can do with this, simply because of the land area and what we use land for. We also have to be careful about putting too much faith in trees, as we see that trees are at risk. We've seen wildfires erupt all over the planet, not just California, but all over the planet this last year, more intense than we've really ever seen before. So that's a risk of betting too heavily on just trees. On the technology side, we have at the pilot stage something called direct air capture and storage. There's a couple pilot plants around the world. We're trying to see if we can get the cost down. This is literally sucking air into a facility and using membranes, catalysts, chemicals that I don't understand because I'm a policy wonk, but being able to extract the CO2, concentrate it, and inject it in safe geologic formations underground. We can also develop dedicated crops, bioenergy crops, that would remove CO2 from the atmosphere as they grow. We could combust them for industry or power generation, capture the CO2, and put it underground. It becomes a net negative source of energy. We're also working on some other cool stuff, enhancing weathering of rocks and minerals. There's seawater capture technology at the pilot stage. This is all stuff that I think we need to invest in because we're going to likely need it. We, despite our best efforts over the next 30 years to reduce emissions, there's a good likelihood we're going to overshoot safe concentration levels. So we're going to have to start removing 1, 2, 5, 10, maybe up to 20 billion tons of CO2 by the end of the century, depending on how successful we are in cutting emissions quickly. So all of these pathways require some form of carbon dioxide removal, either natural and or technological means. So I believe we need to commercialize those technologies. But there is a dissenting view on carbon capture. You should know about it and look at the arguments, weigh the arguments in your mind. One of the best examples recently, just came out this summer, was a paper by the Center for International Environmental Law called Confronting the Myth of Carbon-Free Fossil Fuels, Why Carbon Capture is Not a Climate Solution. What did they say? They said carbon capture doesn't work. It's actually not true. We've been working with it and piloting it enough to know that it does work. We do know how to prevent emissions from going into the sky. They say it's too expensive. Compared to some things, yeah, it's not costless. It's relatively expensive. We're trying to bring the cost down just like we do with any technology. Of course, the important question to ask is too expensive relative to what? What else? They say it's too risky. Yes, you could have a CO2 pipeline burst, just as we have to occasionally deal with power lines going down or a natural gas plant bursting. There's no risk-free energy source or mitigation means. So the question is, are the risks acceptable and manageable? The final thing they argue is that if we develop carbon capture technology, it will just prolong our dependence on fossil fuels. And this is a little bit more interesting argument. It's not just kind of a technological fact or non-fact type of argument. If we perfect this technology and bring the cost down, does that mean we're going to sort of treat ourselves as off the hook and keep burning fossil fuels? I don't think so, but that's something we might want to talk about in the Q&A. What I found most interesting about this, well, one of the many things I found interesting in this paper was that they sort of singled out one of the IPCC pathways. They said, P1 is the way to go. P1 is best. It doesn't involve CCS. It has the best chance of keeping warming at 1.5 degrees. Actually, that's not true. The IPCC doesn't say it has the best chance. They say, here's a bunch of pathways. This pathway involves the rapid phase out of fossil fuels along with limited carbon removal by natural sources. In P1, the IPCC said, we don't need much. We'll do it with trees and soils. So kind of conveniently, if you're against carbon capture, you say, oh, let's do P1. But in my view, and I think in the view of many analysts, the P1 pathway would be wonderful to get on. if we could drop energy use and CO2 emissions extremely fast. When you dig deep into the IPCC report, you find that it assumes that we can drop total world energy consumption by 1/3 by 2030. In 2018, when that published, that was 12 years. Now it's 9 years. I think it's highly implausible for us to think that worldwide we can cut our energy use by 1/3, especially when you think of both industrialized countries and then the developing world, which is still trying to gain basic energy access for hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, if not billions. So, my unifying metaphor, as I said before, we could place all of our chips on renewables. We could shut down our existing nuclear plants. We could abandon research and development on new, safer designs for nuclear plants. We could stop research on carbon capture in its many forms and how it could be used in the power sector, in the industrial sector, and as means to pull CO2 out of the air. We could place all of our chips pretty much on renewables. Is that an acceptable risk? It might work. Personally, I'm doubtful. Personally, I think we need to bring many technology options to commercialization and over time then decide how much we're going to deploy them. But you can't invent a technology in a year. Technology commercialization takes 10 years or more. If we want options, we need to develop them now. So my key messages to wrap up: 4 strategies. Be efficient in everything you do. Electrify everything, and also make some hydrogen, ammonia, and other low-carbon fuels. Produce mountains of zero-carbon electricity, maybe 2 to 3 times what the world generates now. Build out wind and solar aggressively this decade. The integration costs I described still remain low. We're not going to hit them until 60, 70, 80, 90. We're not sure exactly where, but we have plenty of headroom, so build them out. But create viable nuclear and CCS and other options. We're doing also work on advanced geothermal, digging deeper into the earth than we ever have before. We should aggressively commercialize cheaper hydrogen production. We can burn hydrogen for industry as well as power generation. We should expand our transmission system broadly so we can tap into some of the richest areas of solar and wind. Commercialize carbon capture, as I described. This is going to require pipelines, injection sites, governance, and public acceptance. As you know, there's a lot of instinctive recoil against carbon capture, some parts of the public, as there is about nuclear power. Can that be overcome? I think so. It's worth trying. Spread your chips. There's also some global perspectives on this whole issue that I haven't touched on that maybe we can do in discussion. But if the US and, say, European countries aren't involved in the nuclear power industry, we still have countries like Russia and China that are going to be building them and exporting them. I think it's probably better for the world for the US to stay in that game than to exit that game, to ensure anti-proliferation measures, safe storage of waste, safe operation. So we need to think beyond the US shores and think about globally, what are we going to do? What options are there for a country that's not blessed with so much solar and wind and hydro like the US? Landlocked countries, countries further northern latitudes, countries sitting on a pile of coal but very little solar or wind. So those are some international aspects. So I will stop there, and I forget, is someone moderating questions, or do I call? I have a moderator, thank you. Okay, love to take your questions.
It is now time for the question and answer session. Please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We reserve the first question for students, and then we will open it up to the rest of the audience. We will now take the first question.
Was there really a Clark Forum 60 million years ago? No. Sorry, I made that up.
My question is, can you hear me?
I could hear.
You can hear me? Okay, great. My question is, obviously we're going to have to rely on solar and wind in the future a lot more, like you said. Recently I learned that wind is really noisy and causes a lot of disturbances in the West. Is that just we're going to have to deal with that, or is that something we can get around?
Wind has some environmental impacts like any energy source does. Yeah, the noise can bother people, but I think more importantly, unfortunately, wind takes a terrible toll in bird deaths, and the wind industry is trying to work on reducing that impact, particularly on migratory birds. But it has zero carbon emissions, and hopefully we can lean on it very heavily. But I should also note that there's a lot of opposition to building anything in this country. I see signs up at the shore that says, "Stop offshore wind." Some people don't like the idea of seeing windmills way out on the horizon. Should we weight those opinions in how much we develop offshore wind or not? No factual answer to that question.
I was just wondering if you think that, like, there's any, like, you talked a lot about the big ones, like wind and solar, like the up and coming. Do you think that there's going to be more discoveries that we don't know yet that could have that same impact?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing us mammals with big brains are good at is innovation. And there will be, I hope there are pleasant surprises of things that I haven't even mentioned over the next 30 years. But it's important, again, to realize that even almost any idea in this field needs years to develop. So you don't wait till 2030 or 2040 to say, gee, it'd be really nice to have a clean, firm, zero carbon source of power. It's different in other industries, like, of course, cell phones exploded, in the mid-2000s, and boom, it seems instantly everybody had one. That's different from the kind of big industrial equipment, energy generating equipment, where when we trace back, say, the history of solar and wind, there was 20 years of RD&D or more in the 1990s and the 2000s, and then we started really going to scale around 2010 and really increased our output and cost dropped. We need to mimic that with some of these other promising technologies. We have one over here behind. Happy to see the field hockey team well represented and with a question.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering if you think the current administration is doing enough to implement these changes, or if you think they should be doing more.
Mm-hmm. Oh boy, a politics question, so to speak. It's tough. That's a tough one. I think the current administration is going to try to take every step it can using executive power, where it doesn't need to pass new laws or get certain appropriations. For those of you following the news, you know there's an epic battle going on in Washington right now over a infrastructure package, over a very large appropriations package, which would include many climate measures. So my political opinion is that this administration takes the issue very seriously and is trying to do as much as it possibly can. Unfortunately, this issue became very polarized really sort of instantly in 2009. We can talk about that political history if you want, but interestingly, before 2009, if you think back to the presidential candidate on the Republican side, it was John McCain, who had proposed cap-and-trade legislation with Senator Lieberman, a Democrat and Republican, putting forth a national cap-and-trade bill. Prior to 2009, you had a number of Republican governors doing really active things in their states. Romney in Massachusetts, Pawlenty in Minnesota, Schwarzenegger in California. But sadly, for our country, things became polarized in 2009, and one party retreated from seemingly to take climate change seriously and wanting to take action. And we need to fix that. That's a political opinion. That's not a factual scientific statement.
You discussed that when there's low energy available from wind and solar, that we're going to rely on coal-fired power plants and other energy sources. How do you suggest that we keep those plants employed when we're not relying on them because we're using energy from wind and solar, and keep them running?
I just want to clarify the question. How do we keep those plants running, or
people running and have people
employed?
Yeah, have people employed through them because we're going to need them when we need to rely on them.
Yeah.
But then when we don't need them, are they just not going to be there, or how is it going to be run when we're not relying on it?
Yeah. I think what your question is raising something sometimes called a just transition. How do we transition away from fossil fuels to zero carbon sources of energy, and can we help people who are in coal production, oil and gas production? And the answer is yes. We should provide retraining and community assistance and stop major dislocations. And a number of proposals have been put forth along that line. But I think that's what your question was at, but correct me if I'm wrong. Is that okay?
Hi, so you talked a little bit about the fact that, in your opinion, you don't think that carbon capture would kind of be a sort of cop-out for continuing to use non-renewable energy, where, I mean, to me, it does kind of seem a little bit of like a cop-out, because it would allow for prolonged use of some non-renewable energy, and also with things like geological sequestration, there's a limit to how much we can store. So I was just wondering what your opinion is, without very aggressive use of other renewable energies, how is carbon capture not a cop-out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so very important question. One school of thought says that we need to get off of fossil fuels absolutely as quickly as possible. We need to stop all new, production sites and just switch as rapidly as possible out, and not create options for continued use of fossil fuels through something like carbon capture. I respectfully disagree with that. It's a question you can find, experts on both sides of that. I think that particularly natural gas needs to be a bridge fuel over these next 30 years. I think we're going to need it as one of those clean, firm power sources. Put carbon capture on it. It's a very dispatchable source that can complement the solar and wind and those renewables. I also think that as we get a hydrogen economy off the ground, eventually we're going to want to be splitting water molecules. In the nearer term, there's a way to take natural gas and produce hydrogen from it. We're already doing that in small quantities now. So natural gas could be an important bridge fuel or bridge source for both of those. I think just blocking the use of fossil fuels could backfire in a political way if the lights go off or if energy prices go up too high. We're kind of running an experiment like that right now in California, where we are shutting down the last nuclear plant, Diablo Canyon, and the state government is scrambling to try to find a way to make sure they maintain power reliability. And they're realizing they're going to need natural gas and even diesel generators over the next couple of years to keep the lights on. If the lights go out or if rates go too high, I'm afraid to say that some political support for dealing with climate change will melt because people have, the near-term concern is very important. I don't think we should dismiss what I call the moral hazard risk of you commercialize carbon capture technology. Could it lead to longer use of fossil fuels? However, if we are indeed successfully capturing that CO2 and safely storing it, personally, I'm okay with that, because what we really care about is how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, not which particular energy source are we using. Everybody has their favorites. We have one here.
All right, so often whenever you see just banter on the internet over, usually with misinformation around climate change, you usually see people bring up wind power is not a good solution because it costs more carbon than you'll reduce by putting it up, and similar things with solar panels, or you see the argument against electric cars being lithium mining is bad for the environment. Do you think that that's all just misinformation or skewed, or is that a legitimate concern?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag. There was one president who said windmills cause cancer, disinformation, but there's other observations that yes, to build a lot more lithium batteries, that mining will have an environmental impact, and we need to manage that impact. If we try to turn very heavily to the use of biomass, could that crowd out land that we otherwise need for agricultural products and really to feed 7, 8, 9 billion people? So there's some very silly stuff on the internet, surprise, right? But at the same time, I think it's very important for all of us to realize there are going to be some environmental impacts from almost any energy source. Might be traced to the raw materials, to the construction of something, to the operation of something. Almost no energy source has zero impacts, so we need to find ways to manage those impacts, keep the risks as low as possible, and probably use, again, a portfolio of sources and not try to place all of our chips on one. We have one here. Question up here?
Hi. Over here. Hello? I'm interning for the Center for Sustainable Education. I'm working on Dickinson College's climate action plan. What steps do you think that the school should take in the push to decarbonize?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great to see Dickinson and so many colleges taking on sustainability plans, climate action plans. I think I think schools should take a hard look at their heating systems and think about when are we going to be replacing, say, a gas boiler or oil or fuel oil heating of buildings. Maybe that's 5 years from now, maybe that's 10 years from now, 15, not sure. But think about, could we convert to electric heat? Could we convert to deep geothermal heat pumps? That would be a big thing. Converting some of the campus vehicle fleet to hybrid electric or all electric is something that should look at. Making sure, of course, buildings are well insulated and that you've switched over everything possible to LED lights. There's a number of things like that. And students can also think about food sources. We haven't touched on the different carbon impacts of different food sources, but one can, as most of you know, eating lower on the food chain means less GHG emissions. So yeah, there are lots of things that I really encourage that you can do both in your personal life and that a college can do as a whole. We have a microphone. Can we get a microphone back here?
Hi, I have a question. Oh, that's very loud. Hi, I have a question about carbon capture. Specifically, you mentioned ground storing of carbon capture. I'm not an expert in the field, but I read something that can have similar consequences to fracking, with storing the captured carbon in the ground might, sorry, let me rephrase. Storing the captured carbon in the ground may have similar side effects to fracking, with geological disturbances and the poisoning of groundwater?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are some real impacts from fracking, as you described, and but the storage of CO2 underground, we have a long track record of doing it in old oil and gas reservoirs, and I'm not aware of any earthquake issues or groundwater contamination. Ultimately, we're going to be going even deeper to saline aquifers, which again are so deep that scientists do not, and far below any water table. Scientists do not expect those type of risks to emerge. We have one here.
The current manufacturing process of solar panels often releases corrosive materials. How will this be mitigated and regulated enough to prevent serious environmental damages, especially when the largest manufacturer of solar panels is China, or are these effects negligible? Mm-hmm.
I have not looked into that in any detail, so I can't make any definitive answer. I can only fall back on, making almost any product will have some, other than maybe Cheerios or something very benign. You're working with chemicals, you're working with substances, silicon, cobalt. We need good best practice controls on our manufacturing facilities. I don't know any details about solar manufacturing. We had a woman up here, yeah, I think. Yeah,
we have time for 2 more questions.
Hi. It's very obvious that big industries in the economy have a big effect on how we deal with climate change. But I was wondering what exactly that effect would be with going forward with the carbon capturing and just switching to green emissions overall. How would that affect? How would the involvement of big corporations affect that?
Mm-hmm. That's a very, very broad question. I'm not sure exactly how to field it, other than to say we are going to continue to have big companies make big infrastructure. The solar industry, the wind industry, the battery industry, none of these are mom and pop operations. And so we will continue the innovation and the economies of scale of making a lot of this stuff is going to continue to involve large companies. Some companies that don't move into zero carbon energy are going to go bankrupt. Oil and gas companies that don't find ways to exit the business of just uncontrolled oil production are going to have trouble. But barring some massive reorganization of the economy, I don't see large companies disappearing no matter what path we go on. And I'm not sure if that hits your question or not, but I think we have time for one more. Last question?
Yes, we have time for one more question.
Hi there. My question is about, I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how we could bring equitable access to net zero energy solutions to places currently experiencing energy poverty? So similar to like the just transition question that was asked prior.
Yeah, one can look at this from a national perspective or from an international perspective. I think one of the most important issues is really at the international level. We have, again, in some developing countries, we're still lacking access to basic electricity, mobility, safe drinking water, et cetera. And I think, fortunately, the United Nations has put together a collection of sustainable development goals, SDGs, and we're trying to bring, basic energy, sanitation, drinking water access to everyone. I think that can be. I think as we move towards zero carbon energy, typically air pollution goes down as well. So I think that's going to that's going to help in terms of the air quality in some of the developing world cities. But again, it's complex. I probably can't do much more justice to it. With that being the last question, I just want to thank you for being a great audience and for asking really good questions. And no matter what your discipline here at Dickinson or what you might study afterwards, there are going to be many, many opportunities for you to contribute to solving this problem, whether you're in business or science or law or government. We need to keep this issue on everyone's agenda as you go forth. Thank you very much.
Please join me.